This is Letter from America, presented by Dr. Stanford Mukasa. Letter from America is a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. It is a broadcast on Change Radio, an internet-based radio station of the Zimbabwean diaspora and friends from around the world. Change Radio is aimed specifically at giving Zimbabweans and friends at home and abroad news, information, and a diversity of perspectives that are not available to them in the heavily government-controlled broadcast media in the country. The opinions and views expressed in Letter from America are solely those of the presenter and not necessarily of Change Radio.
Today's topic is a severely biased report on the impact of the so-called sanctions on Zimbabwe. It must not have come as a surprise to many people that the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Zimbabwe produced her preliminary report so soon after a visit to the country. Ms. Alena Douha ended her 10-day visit to Zimbabwe on October 28. And on the same day, she was able to give her preliminary findings. However, according to the MDC Alliance Vice President Tendai Biti, the report was issued barely after a meeting with the MDC Alliance delegation. Mr. Biti wondered aloud whether the report had been pre-written and prepaid for. An investigative journalist noticed that some parts of the report were similar to another report Ms. Douha had made on Venezuela and Syria. This prompted the MDC Alliance to send a letter of protest to the United Nations questioning the procedures and other arrangements for Ms. Douha's visit to Zimbabwe. Mr. Biti wanted to know who had sponsored the visit, particularly who had paid for it. It must be noted that the representatives of the United Nations are under strict instructions to be objective and neutral when conducting such investigations. The United Nations Oath of Office requires that the United Nations staff shall be loyal to the United Nations and shall at all times discharge their functions and regulate their conduct with the interests of the United Nations only in view. United Nations personnel, in the performance of their official duties, shall always act with impartiality, objectivity, and professionalism. The United Nations was formed on October 24, 1945, in the aftermath of the Second World War. Its mission was and still is to promote peace and understanding through dialogue. The questions that have been raised about the procedural behavior of Ms. Douha and her one-sided report raise issues about her commitment to the oath of office as mandated by the United Nations. It is reported that she ignored some contributions made by the MDC Alliance, and she did not give an explanation for her action. Some human rights activists like Alex Magaisa said Ms. Douha was hardly an honest broker. She comes from Belarus, one of the world's biggest human rights violators, which is also facing sanctions just like Zimbabwe. Both Magaisa and Biti said Ms. Douha's preliminary report was so one-sided that it could have been written in advance. Her itinerary had initially consisted of meetings with government officials only. According to Human Rights Watch, a non-governmental organization based in Geneva, Switzerland, eventually and perhaps under pressure to at least give the impression of balance, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Commission released a statement inviting submissions from all interested parties, saying that Douha would also like to meet with the non-governmental, business community, civil society organizations, and opposition, in particular those whose activities may be affected by unilateral coercive measures, as well as academics with specific expertise in the field. In terms of the content of her report, Ms. Douha dwelt to great lengths to what she called the impact of sanctions on the Zimbabwean faltering economy. She accused the United States and Europe of violating international law by imposing what she called unilateral sanctions. Had she not been in a hurry to present her preliminary report, and had she taken time to review from an objective and impartial perspective the economic and human rights situation in Zimbabwe, Ms. Douha would have discovered that sanctions were not and are not the primary cause of economic decline and daily human rights violations in the country. She appeared to make the Mnangagwa's ZANU regime victims in this sanctions game. She inflated to incredible proportions what she called the destructive effects of sanctions on the Zimbabwean economy. In her 25-minute presentation, Ms. Douha devoted 22 minutes to bashing countries that imposed what she called sanctions on Zimbabwe. But she devoted barely 3 minutes, repeat, 3 minutes, to issues of human rights violations in Zimbabwe. She even conveniently failed to mention or accept that sanctions were a result of Zimbabwe's default on its loans to international financial institutions, as well as gross human rights violations. Ms. Douha's behavior was a remarkable contrast to the United Nations representative, Dr. Anna Tibaijuka, who in 2005 came to Zimbabwe to investigate the impact of Operation Murambatsvina on Zimbabweans. Operation Murambatsvina was a callous and cruel destruction of homes by the Mugabe regime. It displaced about 1 million Zimbabweans who lost their homes. Unlike Ms. Douha, Dr. Tibaijuka was very professional and impartial. Despite the Mnangagwa regime's claims that international sanctions have undermined the Zimbabwean economy, the reality is that the US, the UK, and the European Union and others have applied targeted sanctions to individuals and companies linked to the ruling ZANU party's human rights abuses and not against the country itself. Ms. Douha completely ignored in her report the endemic corruption in the country. She attributed instead poverty and loss of human rights in Zimbabwe to what she called sanctions. Yet she conspicuously failed to mention that corruption in Zimbabwe had, according to the country's Auditor General, resulted in billions of dollars missing and unaccounted for directly from the Treasury in the Ministry of Finance. $2.7 billion went missing in 2017. $3.5 billion went missing in 2018. $6.9 billion went missing in 2019. About $100 million every month is lost through illicit gold exports from that country. Ms. Douha ignored the fact that nothing was being done by the government to account for billions of dollars that cannot be accounted for. If there was no corruption and measures had been taken to recover missing money, Zimbabwe would have significant amounts to fund education, health, roads, and other infrastructure. A few top government officials who were arrested for corruption have all been released on the grounds there was not enough evidence to convict them. This catch and release trend is now the mantra of how government deals with corruption. A blatant show of fiscal irresponsibility was how the Zimbabwean delegation traveled to Glasgow for the International Conference on Climate Change. According to reports, President Mnangagwa hired a luxury plane from Azerbaijan at a cost of nearly $1 million. He took with him a delegation of more than 100 people. In a remarkable contrast, the president of Zambia, Hakainde Hichilema, traveled to the same destination in a commercial flight and with a delegation of less than 10. His trip reportedly cost less than $10,000. It will be very interesting to see which president will get a more sympathetic ear from potential donors for development aid. Ms. Douha completely ignored the worsening human rights violations in Zimbabwe. According to Human Rights Watch, Zimbabwe's human rights situation continued to decline in 2020 under President Mnangagwa's presidency. Unidentified assailants, suspected to be state security agents, abducted and tortured more than 70 critics of the government during 2020. Security forces also continued to commit arbitrary arrests, violent assaults, abductions, torture, and other abuses against opposition politicians, dissidents, and activists. During 2020, unresolved cases of abductions and abuses, including torture of government critics, escalated without the abductors being brought to justice. What I called catch and release trend. In the last year, over 70 government critics were abducted and later released by unidentified men suspected to be state security agents. In May, 3 Movement for Democratic Change Alliance activists Cecilia Chamberi, Netai Maroa, and a member of parliament, Joanna Mamombe, were abducted from police custody by suspected state agents after taking part in a peaceful protest in Harare. The protest was over the government's failure to support vulnerable communities under the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown. They were assaulted and sexually abused by their abductors. They were then dumped in Bindura, 80 kilometers from Harare. While receiving treatment for their injuries, the trio were arrested at the hospital and charged with making false reports about their abduction. Ms. Douha completely overlooked these human rights violations. For this reason, Ms. Douha's preliminary report will have no value to any effort to resolve Zimbabwe's problem, except to please ZANU-PF regime.
This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening.